Good evening, everyone. My name is Heather Warnken, and I am the Executive Director of the newly launched Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore School of Law. To those joining us here in the live audience, those joining us from across the country via Zoom, and to our co-host, the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, I am thrilled to welcome you to our inaugural event. The Center for Criminal Justice Reform supports community-driven efforts to improve public safety and address the harm and inequity caused by the criminal legal system. We do this by bringing together diverse voices and decision makers to examine how the system currently functions and to collaborate on strategies that promote justice throughout the country and in Baltimore. The center also supports the law school's faculty and students on direct service efforts, including the release of people convicted as juveniles serving lengthy sentences and the exoneration of the wrongfully convicted. I'm so happy to see Professor Erica Suter and UB Law's Innocence Project students in the room tonight. Like this event, the Innocence Project is another proud collaboration with OPD. The center will also add to this law school's nationally recognized clinical offerings with additional experiential learning opportunities across a range of criminal justice reform issues, giving our students the chance to partner with the grassroots organizations, policymakers, and directly impacted people at the heart of this work. The center will also serve as a convener of critical dialogues necessary to addressing the deeply entrenched inequities in our system. Tonight's event exemplifies the center's mission on a number of levels. In 2017, the initial indictments surrounding the Gun Trace Task Force sent shockwaves that reverberate to this day. The harm caused by these horrific events, which captured national attention as one of the most shocking police corruption scandals in Baltimore and perhaps this nation's history, further frayed the troubled relationships with BPD and Baltimore residents, especially Baltimore's Black residents. In October of 2019, Baltimore Police Department Commissioner Michael Harrison and then City Solicitor Andre Davis announced the initiation of an independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding the Gun Trace Task Force. The independent investigation conducted by Steptoe and Johnson LLP resulted in an incredibly thorough 660-page report. Here to make the overwhelming contents and volume of this document, which is critical to the past, present, and future of Baltimore, more accessible, is lead author and investigator, former DOJ Inspector General Michael Bromwich. Mr. Bromwich has an extensive background investigating public corruption and in policing reform. Over the course of his 40-year career, he has worked closely with federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, including serving as independent monitor of the District of Columbia's Metropolitan Police Department, independent investigator of the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, and consultant to the Chicago Police Department on policing reform issues. Now, Mr. Bromwich will have the floor for approximately 45 minutes, laying a foundation for our discussion by presenting key portions of the report's takeaways, both the history of policing in Baltimore that created the conditions for such devastating harms, and recommendations for the path forward. The remaining time will be devoted to questions and comments from both our in-person and Zoom audiences, which you should feel free to begin posing in advance via the Zoom Q&A function or by using note cards available in this room. I have been both unsurprised but deeply impressed by Mr. Bromwich's commitment, shared by so many of us here tonight, to ensuring that this information does not just sit on a shelf, but is used to further real change. The report had this to say about George Santayana's famous quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Quote, "We would add that it is not enough to remember the past. One must learn from it as well. And so the history of corruption in the BPD must provide the knowledge and the tools to minimize it in the future. End quote. Thank you, Mr. Bromwich, for helping to make that possible and more accessible to our community tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, Professor Jaros. Thank you, Dean Weish. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's one of the first times I've been out in public in a very, very long time. This was the only investigation in my career that I've conducted the bulk of the interviews virtually. This is a Baltimore-based investigation, and yet I did most of the interviews from my home in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted that people from the Innocence Project that are affiliated with the Office of Public Defender are here. I've had a long relationship with the Innocence Project going back probably 15 years. In fact, on the drive up here today, I was speaking to one of the co-founders, Peter Neufeld, who, as you know, has done fabulous work over the years. Sure. Is that better? Okay. Okay. Better. It's a big assignment to summarize a report of this length in 45 minutes. And rather than go big picture, I thought I would go small bore at the beginning and start with three stories about three vignettes, really, about three of the former Baltimore Police Department officers who were prosecuted and convicted on various corruption charges. The first is Victor Rivera, who was actually not even a member of the GTTF, but was part of one of the satellite sets of prosecutions brought. Rivera was a young man of Puerto Rican extraction. He was from the Bronx in New York. He grew up with his mother wanting him to become a Catholic priest. He decided he wanted to serve in some other way, and so he decided he wanted to be a police officer. He was so determined to become a police officer that he drove up and down the East Coast when he was about 21, 22 years old, looking for a department that would hire him. None of them would, because his eyesight was so bad. He applied to the Baltimore Police Department, and he was told, no way, we can't hire you. So what he decided to do was to undertake a risky operation because he was legally blind. And he took a risk that his eyesight would deteriorate further, but it didn't. It corrected his vision, and he was accepted as a member of the Baltimore Police Department. He joined at the age of 23 in 1994, and he was originally assigned to the Eastern District. He learned quickly that to be accepted by his peers, he needed to get, quote, down and dirty, unquote. And what that meant to him in various instances was, for example, if a suspect ran from him and his colleagues and they caught up with the suspect, they would beat him up. That was par for the course. That was the cost of the suspect running. And if they had to run a long way, they would beat the suspect up so badly that the suspect would go to the hospital. That was what was getting down and dirty meant. And when we asked him, why did you do that? It's so clearly wrong. He said it was a yearning of his to be accepted by the cool guys in the police department, the officers that everyone looked up to. In 1997, he was engaged in a search warrant with the senior officer. They found some money in a bedroom, and the senior officer looked at the money and kind of shrugged. Rivera took that as, should we steal some of this money? Rivera shrugged back. They stole the money. The senior officer, after the search was completed, divided the money up with Rivera, and that was the beginning of his non-excessive force corruption, but after he had beaten up various suspects. He did it with that same senior officer 10 to 12 times over the course of the next 2 years. And then the two of them were separated, and he stopped stealing until he was reunited with the senior officer, who by that time had become a sergeant in the Baltimore Police Department, a man named William Norline. And they started stealing again, and they stole 10 or 12 additional times. Never large amounts of money, 100 here, a couple hundred there. You wonder why they were even willing to take the risk, but they were. And the reason that Rivera, as he explained it to us, was willing to do it was because he wanted to be accepted by the people that he viewed as exemplary officers and cool officers. Second story, Jamel Ram, one of the GTTF defendants. He came from New Jersey. His father was a police officer. His mother was a teacher. He joined the police department in 2005 at the age of 25. 4 years after he joined the department, in June of 2009, he engaged in a traffic stop, summoned by one of his fellow officers, a man named Michael Sylvester. And Ram and his partner stopped, and as a result of the stop, $11,000 was stolen from that man. That man's name was Gary Brown. Now, a lot of what we found is that some of these thefts, some of this misconduct, in fact, the lion's share of it was never reported. But Gary Brown, the $11,000 he was carrying was, we think, part of a drug deal. And he did not want to be on the hook for being short $11,000. So he reported it. He reported it first to one police district, and then to a second police district, and then to internal affairs within the police department. And there was an internal affairs investigation of the alleged theft. When he was interviewed as part of that investigation, Jamel Ram lied, and he lied repeatedly to the investigator. He said he didn't know the BPD officer who had flagged him down to participate in the traffic stop. And when he was shown a set of photographs to see if he could identify that officer, he said, "No, I can't." Well, it turned out that the officer who had flagged him down, Sylvester, was an academy classmate of his. And when phone records were subpoenaed by the investigator, turned out that Ram and Sylvester had exchanged hundreds of calls and hundreds of text messages before the traffic stop and after the traffic stop. Now, this was a relatively rare case where internal affairs did its job, did it well, and did an investigation where it substantiated the allegations that Ram had lied when he said he didn't know the officer, and when he had said he couldn't identify who the officer was when he was shown photographs. The case ran its course internally within the police department. It took 3 years for it to be completed. The traffic stop happened in 2009. The trial board, which is the internal administrative proceedings within the police department, didn't get started until 2011. It was spread over 3 days. The last day was May of 2012. And Ram was acquitted. Why? Because internal affairs had, according to the members of the trial board, all members of the police department, initiated its internal investigation too long after the events in question, and too long after internal affairs should have realized that misconduct had occurred. That's the second story. The third story involves the central figure in many ways in the gun trace task force, and that is Wayne Jenkins. Jenkins joined the Baltimore Police Department in 2003 at the age of 23, after having been in the Marine Corps for several years. By 2014, 11 years later, he'd already been involved in a large number of crimes, thefts and other crimes, other kinds of misconduct, and what was Jenkins' specialty, traffic accidents. He was notorious for driving at crazy speeds in the city and crashing his car, and obviously crashing into the cars operated by civilians. Well, on March 26, 2014, Jenkins and his partner, a man named Ben Freeman, were following a man named Demetric Simon on foot. Originally, they were following Simon when Simon was driving his car. Simon stopped. He was nervous about the police officers following him, and he started to walk quickly on foot. And then when Jenkins was driving alongside him, Simon started to run. What did Jenkins do? Jenkins ran Simon down with his car. He hit him with his car. He thought, he said, that Simon was dealing drugs and might have had guns. But what did he find after he looked at Simon, who was literally under the rotating wheels of Jenkins's car? Didn't have drugs, didn't have guns. He was in trouble. Jenkins thought he was in trouble. So what did he do? He called one of his colleagues on the Baltimore Police Department. He wanted a gun to plant at the scene. He called that other officer, a man named Keith Gladstone. Gladstone was eating in a restaurant. He didn't have a gun. He asked his partner whether he had a gun. He didn't have a gun. So they ended up calling yet another officer. That officer had a BB gun. So Gladstone and the other fellow drove over to that man's house, picked up the gun, and took it to the scene and planted it on Demetric Simon. They framed him because they couldn't otherwise justify having acted the way they did and having Jenkins chased him in the car. Those are the three stories. So as Heather has mentioned, the public story of the GTTF really began on March 1st, 2017, with the arrests of 7 members of the GTTF. It was the culmination of a year-long investigation that was begun by 2 county police departments, the Baltimore County Police Department and the Harford County Police Department. And it began as a drug investigation, not of any police officers, but of members of a fairly well-known drug trafficking organization called the Shropshire Drug Organization. When evidence surfaced that Mamadou Gondo, one of the members of the GTTF, was in close contact with members of that trafficking organization and seemed to be working in concert with them, the 2 county police departments turned over the information they had to the FBI. And the FBI task force, which included primarily FBI agents, but also carefully selected members of the Baltimore Police Department who had been in internal affairs, they began their own year-long investigation, which included electronic surveillance, wiretaps of Gondo's phone, a bug placed in his police car, and a variety of other really terrific investigative work. And the product of that work was an indictment that was returned by a federal grand jury on February 23rd, 2017, that contained really stunning crimes. Charges of racketeering conspiracy, robbery, extortion, overtime fraud. It alleged that the members of the GTTF had converted the Baltimore Police Department into a racketeering organization. Those are the kinds of charges that are brought against organized crime families, not against police departments. And the labels of the crimes, racketeering, conspiracy, and so forth, in a way concealed how dreadful some of these crimes actually were. Because not only had these officers engaged in the theft of drugs and money, they had done home invasions. They would do traffic stops on the streets, get control of the driver's residence keys, force the suspect to take them to their home and raid the home without a warrant. There were the home invasions. There were, in many, many cases, false affidavits, false police reports that were filed to conceal what the officers had actually done. Now, as Heather mentioned, people were shocked. Some were not surprised, but people were shocked at the gravity of the corruption, the length of time over which it occurred, and the number of officers involved. That's what really made it unprecedented, even in the history of the Baltimore Police Department, which has had previous corruption episodes. Over the next several months, a number of the GTTF members realized that if they were going to reduce the punishment they received, they needed to negotiate plea agreements with the government, and they did. Mamadou Gondo did, Jamel Rayam did, Evodio Hendricks did, Maurice Ward did. And as part of their cooperation with the government, they had to agree to detailed debriefings by the FBI. And as part of those debriefings, they were required to talk about all the crimes they had committed not only those that they had been charged with in the indictment, but others that they had participated in, both as members of the GTTF and earlier in their careers. As part of those debriefings, Gondo and Rayam shared information showing that the sergeant of the GTTF before Wayne Jenkins, a man named Tom Allers, had been involved in criminal activity as well. And the information they provided led to Allers's arrest, indictment, and ultimately his guilty plea. In addition to the 4 members that I've indicated who entered into cooperation agreements with the government tried to enter into a deal with Wayne Jenkins, because even though he was the ringleader, the FBI thought that he could be the source of lots of other information about other corrupt cops. They ultimately concluded, as we say in our report, that he was simply too deceptive, too manipulative, had too uneasy a relationship with the truth for them to enter into that kind of a plea agreement. So they accepted guilty pleas from Jenkins, but they didn't enter into a cooperation agreement with him. But what Jenkins did was to provide information about other episodes, and he pulled back the curtain for the federal government on a drug planting that he'd participated in back in 2010, as well as the gun planting that I just talked about that took place in 2014. And those revelations, that information that Jenkins shared, led either directly or indirectly to charges against 5 other Baltimore Police Department officers, 4 of whom have pled guilty, 1 of whom is scheduled to go to trial. In January and February of 2018, the 2 remaining members of the GTTF who had been indicted but had not pled guilty and not cooperated with the government, Daniel Hersel and Marcus Taylor, went to trial. They were convicted of all charges except 1 firearms count. They each were acquitted on 1 firearms count, but they were found guilty by a jury of every other count. As Heather mentioned, our investigation was commissioned in October of 2019. So a year and a half after the trial of Hersel and Taylor, and 2.5 years after the original arrests and indictments. That was late in the process. And I think if the police department and the city had to do it over again, they would have done it earlier. We were promised full and complete independence in our investigation. Those are the only circumstances under which I would have agreed to do it. And they gave us those guarantees, and they were faithful to those guarantees. They did not get in our way. They responded to the requests for information that we made, lots of requests for information. They helped us get the cooperation of certain witnesses in the police department who were not eager to talk to us. So they did exactly what they promised to do. So there were 2 main questions that we knew we had to try to answer. One was, what were the individual motivations of these individual officers? What made them do what they did? Presumably, they didn't join the police department because they wanted to become criminals. That would be an unusual route to take, to put it mildly. So how did they get sucked into going down the wrong road? I already shared Victor Rivera's story, but we wanted to get the story out of the mouths of the GTTF defendants themselves. So we tried. We wrote a letter to them in January of 2020, just a couple of months after we had been hired. We got 1 phone call from Rayam, who called me in my office. Had a 13-minute phone call with him, and his bottom line is, what's in this for me? What is in this for me? So, well, you could be helpful in allowing some of your former colleagues or some people who are coming into the police department to learn about what the things in your personal life, or what was the temptation? What drew you into corruption? It might help them not do that and not engage in corruption and not go to jail. And he kept coming back to, well, what's in it for me? And I said, well, I don't know that there's anything in it for you. You said you were very sorry at the time that you were sentenced. You apologized to the police department. You apologized to the people of Baltimore. You apologize to your colleagues. This is one way to make good and show that you're actually sorry. What's in it for me? We got a very brief letter from Tom Allers, one of the sergeants in the GTTF. He said, this is the last thing you will hear from me. I don't want to talk to you. You should talk to the prosecutors and the agents about all the lies they told about me, blah, blah, blah. That was the last we heard from him. Most of the others we never heard from at all. So we wrote another letter in July of 2020, basically saying, we think it's important to hear from you. What motivated you? That's part of what we're trying to explain. It's hard to do without your cooperation and without you telling your story. We never heard back from any of them except Jenkins, who played with us for about a year, year and a half. He designated as his representative his former cellmate in prison, who was negotiating with us about doing an interview. He demanded that a production company, as well as the former cellmate, be in the interview with us. We say, we're not going to do that. Those are not the ground rules that we've set, and we're not going to give you any special favors. Finally, in January of 2021, and I was unclear why there was a change of mind, at least temporarily, Jenkins said he would speak with us. And so we had a half-hour preliminary phone call. And at that time, it seemed he had dropped his conditions of having a production crew, a movie studio representative, and his former cellmate sit in on the interview. And so we set up the interview for early March of 2021. And then I started to get emails from his former cellmate, which suggested that they were going to reimpose the conditions. And so I called the prison and talked to Jenkins's counsel the day before the interview was scheduled. I said, is this still on? Is Jenkins still going to go forward? And he came back to me and he said, no, it was going to cancel the interview. So we did not get a meaningful, full-bore interview with Jenkins. And so what we had to do to understand the individuals was to build biographies from BPD records, BPD internal affairs files, and witnesses who worked with them during their careers in BPD. The second question, other than individual motivation we needed to answer, was what were the weaknesses within the police department that allowed this kind of corruption to take root to begin with and to continue for such a long period of time without it being detected? Was it hiring? Was it training? Was it supervision? Was it accountability? That is the system within the department that is designed to figure out when bad things are happening, when misconduct is occurring, and do something about it. We also had to figure out how far back in time do we go? Our focus was on the GTTF. It was created all the way back in 2007, so a full 10 years before the indictments came down. So we knew we had to go back at least that far to figure out why the GTTF had morphed into an ongoing criminal enterprise. But in thinking about it and talking to a few people, we realized we really ought to go back further than that. We really ought to go back to 1999, when Martin O'Malley was elected mayor and ran on a very strong anti-crime platform, which included his desire to bring New York City and New York Police Department's approach to policing, variously known as zero tolerance policing, quality of life policing, broken windows policing, although that's something a little bit different. He decided to bring it to Baltimore, and he brought it in the person of Ed Norris, who was originally deputy commissioner and after a couple of months became the commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department in April of 2000. And so what we did was to look back starting in 1999 and understand what the different strategies and tactics that were used that helped explain why the GTTF made sense to create in 2007 and why it fell apart over time. It was clear to us that corruption in the police department predated 1999, that there were thefts. We found that out from Rivera, that there was a history of excessive use of force, and that there was a culture of filing false police reports. As Jenkins told not us, but a BPD podcaster, He was taught very early that you don't let the facts or you don't let probable cause stand in the way of a good arrest. So we try to answer that second question. What was it about the Baltimore Police Department, not the individuals, that allowed this corruption to take root and to last for such a long period of time? So that's what we spent about 160 interviews over the course of 2 years doing. And that's why we spent countless hours reviewing hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that the police department produced to us, as well as internal affairs files that they produced to us. And so we learned a lot about the different strategies that were implemented by mayors and the police commissioners that worked under them. Martin O'Malley and Ed Norris from 2000 to 2002, where the theme was zero tolerance and quality of life enforcement. Let's enforce the law on minor offenses because minor offenses color the culture, and many of the people who engage in minor offenses also engage in more substantial offenses later on. Norris leaves at the end of 2002, and O'Malley brings down another New York Police Department member, Kevin Clark. Clark has a slightly different strategy. He believes in buy and bust. That is small-scale drug arrests, large numbers of small-scale drug arrests in order to help clean up some of the open-air drug markets that had been a plague in Baltimore for so long. That strategy, although bought into by some members of the police department, ended up alienating many of them because what they saw that they were doing was placing large numbers of people, particularly Black and brown people, in jail for minor drug offenses and permanently tarnishing their records and really compromising their life chances. Clark left at the end of 2004. He had a domestic incident that occurred here. O'Malley lost confidence in him. And so he's replaced by Leonard Ham, who'd been a 20-plus year veteran of the police department, had left the police department. O'Malley had brought him back in as a deputy commissioner, and when Clark resigned, Ham became the new commissioner. Ham was not a very active commissioner. Most people in the department thought that the deputy commissioner, a guy by the name of Marcus Brown, who was a colleague and old friend of O'Malley's, was actually running the department on a day-to-day basis. Crime continued to exist at very high levels, including violent crime at very high levels in the department, in the city. But under Ham, and then under Sheila Dixon, who became mayor when O'Malley was elected governor in November of 2006, a realization began to really set in that the high volume of arrests, the buy and bust strategy, which was somewhat modified under Ham and under Marcus Brown, still wasn't working. And crime continued to exist at very high levels. And members of the police department began to realize in a big way that there were just diminishing returns to arresting such large numbers of people. So in mid-2007, Mayor Dixon fired Commissioner Ham and brought in as commissioner, first as acting commissioner and then as permanent commissioner, Fred Bielfeld. Bielfeld had been a well-decorated narcotics cop in the department for many years, and he had stopped believing in the high volume arrests that had been occurring for both under zero tolerance and under buy and bust. And his focus was a strategy called bad guys with guns. And he used that phrase all the time in the city. But it was a way of focusing both the public and the police department that they were going to get out of the business of high volume of arrests and instead target suspects who were engaged in violent crime. It was not going to be a numbers game. It was going to be a quality of arrests strategy. And at least at the beginning, and really for several years, that strategy was successful. The number of homicides dropped. In fact, in 2011, it went below 200 for the first time in, I think, 30 years. And in general, under Bielfeld, from 2007 to 2012, the number of homicides dropped. And he viewed it as a vindication of his strategy that at the same time as the number of homicides dropped, the number of arrests dropped. The police department was being much more selective about the people that they arrested. The GTTF was created in 2007, jointly by Bielefeld and Cheryl Goldstein, who at the time was head of the Office on Community Policing in the mayor's office. And what both of them had recognized is that the lion's share of guns that were used to commit crimes in Baltimore came from outside Baltimore. And so they had the idea, we need to investigate the source of these guns. They don't come from the city. Many of them don't come from the state. So let's set up an analytic and investigative unit that's going to figure out where these guns come from. That way, we'll be able to make cases against firearms trafficking organizations. We'll be able to make cases against so-called straw purchasers, that is, people who buy guns for other people who otherwise wouldn't be eligible to buy guns. And let's do it that way, and let's increase our chances of success by joining forces with other law enforcement agencies. And so Bielefeld personally recruited with the participation of the Maryland State Police and the Baltimore County Police Department. And he and Goldstein and others thought that through that multi-agency approach, they would have a better chance of making those firearms trafficking cases and those straw purchaser cases. But the goal was to make the GTTF what it sounded like, a gun trace task force. The problem was that even though the initial recruits were people who were committed to the analytic and investigative task that was incorporated in the mission statement of the GTTF, over time, within 2 years, the task force lost its focus. Part of it was a leadership issue. Part of it was lack of attention from top management in the police department. But within 2 years, by 2009, the gun trace task force wasn't actually spending much time tracing guns. It had become a street enforcement unit. It had become just another jump out squad. And without a change in its declared mission, it had become something almost the opposite of what it was originally created to do. Part of the problem was a failure in supervision. The original supervisor of the GTTF, a man named Rick Willard, was suspended because of domestic issues of his own. And it took some time for them to replace him. And they replaced him with a man named Kevin Jones, Kevin A. Jones, because there are actually two Kevin Jones in this investigation, the other named Kevin E. Jones. And Kevin A. Jones did not have an investigative or analytic background. He had an enforcement background. And what he found is that he just wasn't getting guidance on what he was supposed to do with the GTTF because there was generally a lack of clarity in the police department about what the GTTF was supposed to do. Bielefeld, who had created it, was occupied with so many other issues as commissioner that he had largely lost touch with it. And many of the other senior command staff members in the police department didn't believe in the GTTF's mission to begin with. So the GTTF started to stray from what it had been originally. And over time, one of the agency partners, the Maryland State Police, dropped out of the GTTF by the end of 2009. And despite the fact that we did a number of interviews and we tried to probe whether it was because they were dissatisfied with the directions in which the GTTF was going, we were told, nah, we just had a better offer from ATF, from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency of the Treasury Department. It was just a more attractive offer. There was a different story with respect to the other agency partner, the Baltimore County Police Department, which became increasingly upset about the way that the Gun Trace Task Force and its members was doing its work. It claimed that contrary to the memorandum of understanding that it had signed with the Baltimore Police Department in 2008 and 2009, the Baltimore Police Department members were not living up to that. They were not sharing the search warrants they got for Baltimore County residences. They were not calling Baltimore County police members in time so that they could participate with the GTTF in searches of Baltimore County residences. And this happened time after time after time after time, until finally the Baltimore County Police Department had it. And they said, we're out. We're not doing this anymore. And that happened in March of 2011. Now, 2011, 2012, Bielefeld was forced to resign or voluntarily resign, but he saw the handwriting on the wall. He was replaced by Anthony Batts, who was supposedly a reform commissioner. Batts was like a duck out of water in Baltimore, didn't connect with the community, didn't connect with his own rank and file. The extent of violent crime continued to grow back to the levels it had existed before, and he was fired in the summer of 2015. The precipitating event for his being fired was the death of Freddie Gray and the riots and unrest that followed. He was replaced by Kevin Davis, who continued to be the commissioner until early 2018. The problem was that because of the riots following Freddie Gray's death, a lot of the Baltimore Police Department decided that it was not going to pursue policing as aggressively as it had before. And what that did, in large part, was to open the door to aggressive members of the police department, like Wayne Jenkins, like the members of his special enforcement squad, like Tom Allers and the GTTF, to launch a higher level of criminality in the city of Baltimore. And so what we found, what the FBI found, was that in 2014, 2015, in particular 2016, there were a huge number of crimes committed by these two squads. First, Jenkins's special enforcement squad, and also the GTTF. And then in June of 16, Jenkins takes over the GTTF, and you have a squad of 7 people who are all committed to committing various kinds of crimes: thefts, illegal street stops, home invasions, and so on. So we lay out this story in great detail in the report, and I'm going to stop the chronology there and tell you a little bit about our overall findings of the 2-year investigation. First, we found in general that there was inadequate supervision of plainclothes units in the department as a whole. Of plainclothes units generally, but particularly of the GTTF. There was a lack of leadership training in the department, so that people who were promoted to the ranks of sergeant and above were not trained in how to lead, in how to manage people, and how to lead them in doing ethical and constitutional policing. We found that there was completely inadequate scrutiny of so-called productive officers and productive squads. If you were productive, if you had high levels of drug seizures and gun seizures, that seemed to give you a license to do it in any way that you wanted to do it, regardless of the law. And that's what happened. People like Jenkins, people like Gladstone were extremely productive. And there was an incentive for their supervisors not to look too closely about why they were being productive and how they were being productive. And then you had the wild card of 3 corrupt frontline supervisors, Jenkins and Allers and Gladstone. And the fact is that lieutenants and captains and above them in the chain of command frequently are spread so thin that they're not going to be able to see the corruption of individual officers. And so they count on sergeants to do that kind of supervision. If you have corrupt sergeants, it's very, very hard to identify corruption. Second thing we found was that the police department relied too heavily on numbers, on production, to the exclusion of other considerations. ComStat, which was a system of accountability that was brought down from New York, was really transformed in the Baltimore Police Department from an accountability tool into scorekeeping, crude scorekeeping. The fortunes of supervisors in the department were driven by the numbers that they and their squads produced. And the greater the productivity that the squad showed, the less the supervision, because there was no incentive to kill the goose that was laying the golden egg. That led to the coddling, promoting, and protecting productive members of the department, productive measured in pure numerical terms. And a numbers mentality led inevitably to an ends justify the means mentality. If you were putting the numbers on the board, there was just not a lot of inquiry into how you were doing it. And then the final set of findings were global failures in the police department's internal accountability system. There was simply not a system for swift and consistent justice in the face of allegations of corruption or misconduct. Over the years, over the 20 years or so that we studied, internal affairs was characterized by insufficient resources, inadequate leadership, and frankly, insufficient talent among its investigators. There was also cynicism, deep-rooted cynicism in the police department itself about the internal affairs function and whether it was a legitimate function. Nobody who we talked to, we talked to a number of people, we said, did you ever consider working in internal affairs? And the looks that we got were, are you crazy? Why would we ever do that? In a police department with a respected and robust internal affairs function, you should have good people wanting to go into internal affairs. You should have incentives in your department trying to induce people to come to internal affairs. That hasn't existed historically within the police department. There was also the failure of trial boards, the administrative tribunals within the police department who sit in judgment of officers who are accused of misconduct. The trial boards frequently acquitted in cases in which the evidence was overwhelming. There were rumors, although we never substantiated this specifically, that there was interference by senior members of the department who would call members of the trial board and say, hey, my guy, go easy on him. He's a producer. There seems to be a widespread view that that happened. We could not pin down any specific case in which it happened, but that is widely believed in the police department. And the failure of the trial board system and of the accountability system generally is really demonstrated in no clearer way than in saying that in our view, after having done the investigation that we did, it was clear to us that at least 4 members, Jenkins, Herschel, Ram, and Hankard, shouldn't have been in the police department anymore when they were committing their crimes. They had done things, facts supported they had done things that should have resulted in their termination. But clearly that didn't happen. So I don't know if I should go on further. I've got recommendations to summarize, but if we're getting close to the time limit, you tell me what you prefer.
I think if you want to share a few more
Sure.
of the key recommendations, that would be great.
So let me summarize the recommendations, and there were 26 of them total, and we divided them into various categories. So the first category is hiring. First recommendation is there should never, ever be shortcuts in terms of the qualifications that you insist on when you hire people. There is a tendency, as there is not only in Baltimore right now, but everywhere in the country, when you have a shortage of applications and a large number of positions to fill, to cut back on standards that you're requiring. Should never, ever do that, ever. We know in Washington, D.C., for example, that was done in the late 80s and early 90s. That led to a huge amount of corruption in the late 90s. And if you talk to Chuck Ramsey, who was the chief back then, he says it was clearly attributable to the lowering of standards at that time. Second, there need to be careful, thorough background investigations that are done of every applicant to the police department. We recommended that that be brought internal within the police department and given to members of the department or retired members of the department rather than being contracted out, because we think people in the department should care more about the quality and the ethics of people that they're hiring than a contractor. The police department is happy with their contractor, and for financial reasons, they're unable to do that. So we have an agreement to disagree on that. Third recommendation under hiring is to enhance the aspects of integrity testing that they do, the polygraph examinations they do, the psychological examinations that they do, to try to weed out as much as possible people who are high risks when they're applying to the police department. Those are the hiring recommendations. The training recommendations, we found something that was quite surprising to me, and I've been around law enforcement agencies and police departments for a long time. There was historically a culture of cheating, widespread cheating in the police academy. Answers would be given to tests. People who failed tests would be taken out privately and administer the test privately, and all of a sudden they would pass. This was done for years and years and years, so that if 50 people came into an academy class, 50 people would graduate. We asked each of the members of the police department and former members of the police department, did you identify people in your class that you thought would never cut it at police officers, either because of their physical skills or their intellectual ability, or whether they had anger management or impulse control issues? And almost every one of them said, oh yeah. There were one or two or three or maybe even four that shouldn't have been in the class and should not have graduated. And in every case, they did graduate. And in almost every case, they were out within 1 or 2 or 3 years for misconduct or corruption or something else. So zero tolerance for cheating at the academy. It should be obvious, but it's important. Second, to deal with the fact that if you're in the academy, you're with your fellow recruits more than the training staff is. And you might see things after hours that really worry you. Somebody who can't manage their impulses or control their temper. So we advocated creating an anonymous reporting system within the academy, so people could report their colleagues if they felt that that person could become a risk to the police department. This is not about gossip. This is not about somebody you don't like the way they dress. This is about concern and suspicion that somebody will create a risk to the police department and the Baltimore community because of the kind of person they seem to be. The next is the police department needs to come to grips with its history of corruption. And until very recently, it never did. It never focused internally during recruit training or in-service training on the corruption that has bubbled up from time to time in this police department. It simply didn't confront it. The Baltimore Police Department is not unique in that regard. I've dealt with organizations, including private companies, major corporations, other law enforcement agencies. They don't like to face the dirty laundry that exists, but you have to. The Baltimore Police Department has started to do that. They need to do a better and more detailed job than they've started to do. Part of bringing corruption home to recruits and existing officers is forcing them to look at corrupt cops in person and victims of corruption in person. That's not been done in the police department. You can talk all you want about abstractions. You can even have very detailed presentations on corruption. You need to hear corrupt cops talk about why they became corrupt, the personal factors, the professional influences that caused them to be corrupt. And as importantly, if not more importantly, you need to hear from their victims what being the victim of corruption did to their lives, may have ruined their lives, impaired their chances to get a good job, to support their family adequately. That's never been done in the police department. Baltimore is not alone in that regard. I doubt that's been done in any police department in the country. It should be done so that the reality of corruption is brought home to police officers so they understand the full and complete costs of engaging in corruption. The training academy needs to emphasize, and again, this should be obvious, but it's not, to emphasize the need for truthfulness, complete truthfulness in all of the submissions they make, both within the police department and to courts. There has been a culture of not doing that, of embellishing the facts, of inventing facts, of adding facts that you think you need to justify a stop or an arrest. That's got to stop. And police officers need to learn to live with the consequences. If they fall short based on the truth, so be it. That's justice. So that needs to be done to a far greater extent than it ever has been. And finally, with respect to training, the police department has initiated a really terrific training program called EPIC. Ethical Policing is Courageous. Now, a lot of people, when they hear the title, say, what is that? I sat through it, and I did focus groups with the facilitators within the police department. What it is it's a training program that teaches police officers to intervene with their peers, with their colleagues, when they see that their colleagues look like they're about to engage in misconduct. Stop it. Putting an arm on their shoulder, drawing them back, whatever, to stop them from doing it. And it's been presented, I think, wisely as a health and wellness part of the program, something separate from internal affairs. This is different from turning in your colleague, although there's an obligation to do that. This is about preventing misconduct on the street in the moment. It's a program that Commissioner Harrison brought with him from New Orleans, was very successful there. It's being successful here. They won over a lot of doubters who didn't think that it could work or that members of this police department would be receptive to it. But they have been, and I think that needs to be built on. Now, in terms of our recommendations on supervision, we say a lot of new police officers are lost in the police department. Victor Rivera was lost, which is why he wanted to be one of the guys and agreed to start stealing in 1997. So the police department has an institutional responsibility to try to deal with that. So we recommended that each new recruit, when they graduate from the academy and they go through their field training, that they get a mentor, an individual mentor for 5 years, who is their big sister or their big brother within the department, to whom they can go if they're facing a situation that they may not want to talk to their supervisor about, or they're having personal problems that's related to their job. Someone they can talk to, someone who's been carefully vetted within the department as somebody who is reliable, who will guide people in the right direction. Everybody in a new job needs direction. It's particularly true of law enforcement officers, particularly in a city like Baltimore, to have that kind of adult guidance. So that's one of our recommendations. Another thing we were surprised to see is that new supervisors, when they come into a new assignment, they aren't briefed about what that squad does or how they've done it, or who are the good people, who are the not so good people, who do you have to watch out for? That needs to be done. That kind of transition from one supervisor to another needs to take place. One of the things we found in our investigation is that the productive officers, particularly Jenkins, went outside the chain of command. He leaped 2 or 3 levels to get support for what he was doing and to get special assignments. Not that those people necessarily knew that he was engaging in corruption, but what it did was to break the chain of command and allow Jenkins to operate in an unsupervised way throughout the city. So it is very important in any law enforcement organization, particularly in the Baltimore Police Department, to insist on a chain of command. There needs to be tight screening and vetting of members who are in plainclothes squads. Those are clearly the squads that create the greatest risk for the community and for the police department. There needs to be tighter screening than there has been in the past. And there needs to be notification of supervisors if someone on their squad is the subject of a serious misconduct investigation that may include lying. The supervisor needs to know about that so they can keep them from being in a position where they have to testify in cases. And then finally, our recommendations on oversight and accountability. It's actually the largest number. There needs to be intensified efforts to recruit good people into internal affairs. There need to be more accurate tracking of complaints, so there's not duplication of complaints that are in the system twice or more than twice. There needs to be, as part of the accountability function, closer oversight over high-performing units like the Gun Trace Task Force. There needs to be an emphasis on quality cases, not the quantity of cases. There needs to be intense training on interviewing skills and writing skills for internal affairs members. There needs to be training of members of the trial board so they understand that the standard of proof that they're operating with is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's preponderance of the evidence. There seems to be not really understandably to me, great confusion about what the standard of proof is, even from people who have served on trial boards over and over again. It's a preponderance of the evidence. It's 50.1%. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. And then we have a sort of a miscellaneous section of recommendations, only 3. There needs to be detailed exit interviews of all sworn members leaving the department. You need to get access to that institutional knowledge that people leaving the department have accumulated. You need to have incoming commissioners debrief their predecessors so they get the benefit of their experience in running the department. We need, and this is very important, it was emphasized by a number of the commissioners we interviewed, need to get City Hall out of the hair of the police department. Priorities need to be set at City Hall, but in terms of involvement in individual investigations or individual personnel decisions, City Hall needs to get out of that business. And then finally, relevant to the delay that we faced, in the event of a future corruption investigation, and there will be future corruption, you can't eliminate corruption. You can minimize it. You can lower the risk. You can never eliminate it. There needs to be a prompt independent review of any future corruption episodes so that people of the city don't have to wait 4 years, 5 years to find out what actually happened. I don't want to end on a completely negative note. The city knew that this would be not a cheerful or positive report when they hired us. So let me focus on a couple of very promising developments. Number one is the consent decree process, which is under the supervision of the federal court here, Judge Berdar. I've seen the consent decree process work in multiple cities. We had something a little different in DC where there was the same kind of agreement, although it was not under court supervision. That police department improved enormously over the course of the 6 years of federal supervision. It works. It's not as fast as a lot of people would like, but it works. And so I would suggest that people be patient. Second, I think the prevalence of body-worn cameras is a huge advance for everybody, for the police department, for the community, for confidence in what actually happened with respect to a particular incident. It's being used extensively in the police department to audit the conduct of various police officers. It's being used by the state's attorney's office as part of their investigations. That's a positive step, that there is so much evidence generated by body-worn cameras that can be used. And although it's not frequently touted as an anti-corruption step, it is an anti-corruption step. Third is the reform of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which has existed in Maryland. It's one of the first states to pass it, I believe, from the mid-'70s. And it has been repealed. What takes its place, I think, is still very much a work in progress. But I think that what we were able to see was the tremendous dysfunction that existed under the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights in its prior form. And so almost anything would be an improvement. The fourth promising thing is the thing I mentioned a moment ago, which is the EPIC training program. The department needs to build on that and make it really the cornerstone of its training. And then finally, the need to be honest about the past. And I think our investigation, the lack of interference with our investigation, the fact that the police department has agreed to implement virtually all of the recommendations, honesty about the past is a critical component and a very hopeful step, I think, for the police department to improve. So I've gone longer than advertised. I apologize for that. I'm happy to take that.
No, thank you so much. And I'm glad you were able to hit those recommendations at the end. I think that's critically important, especially because we are here to collaborate on the path forward. With that, we will turn it over to audience members, both in the room and via Zoom with Q&A. So anyone in person, if you want to come up to the microphone, and we're happy to start with you, Debbie. And then our faculty director, David Jaros, will be monitoring the questions via Zoom.
So Mr. Bromwich, I want to say thank you for coming tonight, and thank you to the center I can take my mask down? I can get right up to the microphone. I wanted to say thank you for your work. I think it's a rare circumstance when a client hires you to criticize and inspect every nook and cranny, and you did that and you did it well. So in that regard, you are a hero to us. And I thank the center for partnering with OPD to come tonight to make this live and in person. It is encouraging to see prosecutors here. I hope that we have judges listening. To the extent, my question for you, obviously, is that we think that this is over. As a public defender, I can obviously tell you that it's absolutely not over. We spoke previously and I asked you about including victim stories in your work, and you explained that you had to end somewhere. And we hope that you encourage conversations in the future with victims. But the thing that sticks out to me and why I'm excited to be here tonight is to ask, hopefully your client, the police department, is listening, because we still have many, many members named in the report currently on the payroll at the Baltimore Police Department. And when you say we have to face our own corruption, I'd like to take 1 second to read to you some of the names of the folks implicated as direct supervisors of the Gun Trace Task Force. Sean Miller, Kevin A. Jones, Lieutenant Margie German, Chris O'Ree. Those are direct supervisors of the Gun Trace Task Force sitting in high places today in the Baltimore Police Department. Other officers still on payroll and interacting and arresting the public. John Burns, he's not arresting, but he's on the payroll. Kenneth Ivory, I previously, right before the pandemic, won a motion to suppress on an illegal search because he's still out arresting people, although implicated in the trial and in theft. Ryan Hill, Craig Jester, Kevin Fassel, Calvin Moss, Joseph Landsman. And I ask tonight that you could go back to your client and have a real sit down with them. And when I say your client, I mean the Baltimore Police Department. And how do we expect the citizens of Baltimore to feel confident that they mean that there's going to be reform? Ask the city council. We had the Commission to Restore Trust in Policing by the legislature. But really on the ground, what is being done to save face, to act like they mean it, to make amends with the citizens of Baltimore, and to continue to stop torturing people on a daily basis? To answer that question is where is, I guess, Commissioner Harrison? I personally sent him an email and I asked him to come. These are real questions that we need to have answered by the police department. To what could you say? Do you have a communication open with your client that you could bring those concerns directly back to them?
Well, so we think the communication with our client is largely in the report, right? We didn't hold back on anything. We named names. We described the conduct. On the other hand, I want to be clear that just because somebody was in the supervisory chain doesn't mean they knew about the misconduct or they're complicit in the misconduct. And so I want to be very careful about that. We did in this report state that 2 people who have not been charged with crimes engaged in crimes. They're no longer with the police department. But we did that. And if we had developed evidence that any of the people that you mentioned had committed crimes, we would have said so. We did have some communications along the way with people in the police department about 1 or more of the people that you mentioned. And I was very frank with them about the evidence that we were developing. None of that evidence has been held back. It's all in the report. And so now it's really up to the police department to do what it thinks is appropriate with the information that's there.
Good evening. First, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight and having this platform, which is very necessary and very important.
Can you speak right into the mic so the people online can hear you?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having this very important platform, which is very necessary to Baltimore City and our residents and community. My question is something that you said that I already wrote at home and something I already asked a couple people about could we do. I'm the mother of Dale Graham. He used to go to school here. He was a law student and he had got killed by a Baltimore City police officer in 2008. And so I'm here and representing him as his voice. But what I wrote is this question to you, and I've already done this at home. And I want to ask you, what steps do we need to take for in-person interview for the corrupt cops, victims and families who experience this excessive force and loss of our loved ones? And can mothers be involved so we can share our stories? I feel it's very necessary for us to have this conversation. And when you're ready, I'm ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will make sure that word gets communicated to the police department and others in the city if they're not listening.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is that on? All right. So I'm going to read some of the questions online, but people should be encouraged to come up and ask questions if they want. We can go back and forth. The first question that was asked was, what will happen to the records that you compiled during your investigation?
So the record, probably too much of the record, is in the 660 pages that we published. We have obviously the documents that we acquired, both the internal affairs documents and the other documents, and the record of the interviews that we did are in the files of my law firm. We did interviews. We did 160 plus interviews. They averaged about 3 hours in length. We obviously did not reproduce all of the information that we gained during those interviews in the report. And so we still have those. That's the body of the information that we collected. We tough choices had to be made about what to include in the report. There were 40 some witnesses that we didn't cite at all in the report because frankly, they didn't provide information that we thought added to what we already had. But no, there is a discrete body of information that we have that we collected during the investigation. It's in the custody and control of my law firm.
Well, I'd very much like to join others in thanking you, Mr. Bromwich, for being here and being the speaker at our inaugural event of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform. Your presentation is important and fascinating, and we thank you for it. My question is, how, in your view, and you've seen not just the Baltimore Police Department, but police departments across the country, how aberrational is Baltimore? How much worse is the culture, or was the culture here, or is the culture here in the Baltimore Police Department as compared to policing across America? Are the problems that you identified endemic to policing, or is it something about Baltimore that's especially broken?
So it's a great question. And obviously, because I have not sampled the 18,000 police departments in the country, it's difficult for me to answer. I think that there have been highly publicized scandals in various cities, most big cities. In New York, as you know, there was a series of scandals that led to the Knapp Commission in the early 70s. Another major scandal in New York that was focused on by the Mullen Commission in the early 90s. There have been a series of scandals, one called the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles with the LAPD. So I think that to some degree, there is corruption in every major police department, particularly every major urban police department where there are drugs, where there are guns and so forth, and where the challenges facing police departments are so great and that there are greater temptations for police officers. I think what we saw with the Gun Trace Task Force is extraordinary, both in the number of officers who were involved, the length of time it lasted without being detected, the kinds of crimes they engaged in. I think that is out of the ordinary. And worse than in many of the other departments that I've seen. Chicago, where I spent 3 years as a consultant of the police department, has unfortunately a rich tradition of corruption. And they are going through one of their scandals right now related to a sergeant who did all sorts of horrible things. So I think that there has been a culture here that was that accepted it more, that didn't do more to root it out. I think part of that is traceable to the fact that there has been for so long a relatively impotent internal affairs or accountability function. I think that works better in a lot of cities than it has historically here. I think there are improvements being made in internal affairs here right now. I think the new leadership that it has, the department brought over somebody from the FBI, and I think he's making improvements there. But I think there is a longer way to go here for internal affairs and in dealing with corruption generally than there is in many other cities.
Thank you.
So there are several questions, and for those on Zoom, you can ask a question either in the chat or in the question and answer box. But there's been several questions about the consent decree, and wondering if you could expand on whether or not you think the consent decree is actually helping, whether or not this report can be part of that work, and is this a positive force for change?
I'm a believer in consent decrees, and I should declare an interest. I've been involved in the Department of Justice's pattern or practice civil rights investigation of law enforcement agencies for 20 years. And I saw firsthand when I was the monitor of the DC Police Department from 2002 to 2008, what improvements can be made under federal oversight and with a monitor's supervision. You need stable and good leadership of your police department for the consent decree process to work well. You didn't have that in the first few years of the consent decree here. You had Commissioner Davis, followed for a few months by Commissioner D'Souza, followed by Interim Commissioner Tuggle, and now followed by Michael Harrison. Commissioner Harrison told me, it's in the report, that he would not have accepted the job here if there had not been a consent decree, because he thinks it's a critical way of forcing reform in a police department that has proved resistant to reform previously. So I think the consent decree can work. It should work. People need to be patient. I will say that, but for Judge Berdar, who is the judge presiding over the consent decree, I don't think our investigation would have ever happened, or it may not have ever happened. He was pushing, starting in early 2018, that there needed to be what he described as an autopsy. We need to find out why the patient died. In this case, integrity among these members of the police department. And for various reasons that I'm not clear about, the city and the police department was uncomfortable with commissioning this kind of an investigation. And then Commissioner Harrison made a priority. He said, we need to do this. His new head of internal affairs, Deputy Commissioner Nadeau, said, we need to do this. And the city changed its position. But I don't know that it would have done so without the pressure from Judge Berdar. Judge Berdar took a great interest in the selection process. I met with him at the time that I was selected. He has shown great interest in the report. I appeared in front of him on January 20th, just a week after the report was released, and gave a 2-hour presentation on what we found during the investigation. He clearly had read it all. He asked lots of very specific factual questions about the report. And I think he has very much taken it on board. I suspect the monitoring team has taken it on board. I think the police department has taken it on board. Exactly what role the report will play in the consent decree as it moves forward, I don't know. But there is a lot of overlap between the topics that we focused on, particularly the accountability piece, but also hiring, training, and supervision. There's a lot of overlap between what we're doing and what's covered by the consent decree and being reviewed by the monitoring team.
Mr. Bromwich, thanks very much for being here. My name is Byron Warnken. I'm an attorney in Baltimore County, and Heather's brother also. So your report is obviously incredibly comprehensive, and you've got 26 suggestions, recommendations. What should people be looking at to determine whether these recommendations are being taken, who's responsible for this? And I know I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here. And obviously it's the police commissioner, obviously mayor is relevant, but what, in a nuts and bolts way, to the extent that you know, should the average person be looking at to see reform in action or a lack of reform?
I know a lot more about this today than I did a week ago, because I actually set out notes to various people who I'd interviewed during the investigation saying, what did you think? What's your reaction? And I got a response from one of them who was responsible for implementing the recommendations. And he specifically told me that his unit is responsible for implementing the recommendations. And he feels good that that's his assignment, because he thinks the proper implementation is very, very important. So I think what people should expect is a report out on the implementation of the recommendations. And I don't know whether it's 6 months from now or a year from now or what the cadence should be, but they should expect, your city hall, your city council should expect a progress report on implementing the recommendations. These recommendations, there are multiple strategies of doing recommendations. You can make 600 recommendations that get into the absolute granular aspects of things. And that will necessarily overwhelm an organization. You can't do that. That's what one of the reports that was done for Commissioner Batts did. It gave a million different recommendations. You can't do that. And so what our goal was to let's have a reasonable number of recommendations that are doable for this department and that would make a difference in terms of what we found in the report, in terms of weaknesses in the police department. And so that's why we came up with 25. I actually settled on that number sort of arbitrarily. I said we can't go much higher than that because then it becomes unmanageable for the police department.
To be clear, for people who aren't familiar, you're not engaged at this point. Your engagement was to produce this report.
Correct.
Got it. So it's on people like Heather in the center and certainly Debbie to see about that 6 months, 12 months out.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yep. To be clear, I haven't been fired, but I don't think I have any additional work to do at this point.
I know there's another question from the floor, but let me do one more from online because it relates to those recommendations. Someone was noting that there wasn't a recommendation for the creation of a corrupt or dishonest police officer database that might be used, for example, by the defense bar to try and uncover and deal with this issue. And this person wrote that they have not been practicing long, but they've seen enough cops tripped up on what can only be described as lies while testifying. What do we do about judges and prosecutors who are unwilling to sanction those cops? Does it make sense to start documenting this in a way that allows for impeachment in future cases? Did you consider that?
We really didn't consider that. I think that I hope that this is eye-opening not only to members of the defense bar who are not as aware of it as the Office of the Public Defender and who don't realize that this has been a problem, but judges who have had police officers come into their courtroom and lied to them. And I think they may know more now about some of the types of lies that they've been told, and hopefully they will be more vigilant than they have been in the past.
I would like to build on that just briefly before we go to the next question, because this theme of the disregard for truth as both a widespread form of corruption and also a slippery slope to many other forms of corruption, and also something that shakes the foundations of the very legitimacy of the system. And so before we move on, I just wanted to pull out, one quote that really jumped out at me about this and get any additional thoughts you have. This was around the practice of submitting false, incomplete, or misleading information in police reports, in applications for search warrants, and in court testimony. That this begins early in their careers. And according to the witnesses we interviewed, this has been a widespread problem. Quote, "We have no reliable way to measure the extent to which it remains so." And I don't know if you want to add anything about nuts and bolts. Again, what do we do about that, even to continue to assess the problem, which it sounds like you're laying as a foundational step to even what we do about it?
Right. There is actually no way that we could have done that, even if we had interviewed everyone in the police department, which was obviously impractical. But picking up first on your slippery slope comment, I think we also say that many police officers who we talked to about this issue really didn't even view it as corruption or that there was anything wrong with it. It was, I think, a little bit of the ends justify the means mentality. If they think somebody is a bad person and committed the crime, even though there isn't enough evidence to actually make an arrest or apply for a search warrant, they nevertheless will invent or add the additional material to make the case. It is foundational, and it was disturbing to us to hear how casually it was done. It was disturbing just in terms of looking at what the federal investigation had put together, the number of times that lies were told in police reports, in applications for search warrants, in all sorts of documents. And so there are a lot of factors that I think have pushed in that direction historically. I think one of the ways to stop it, one of the main ways to stop it, one of the hardest ways to stop it, is for first line supervisors in the police department, sergeants, if they see a write-up that doesn't seem right to them, to say, I don't believe that that's what you saw. Tell me what actually happened. So for frontline supervisors and supervisors above frontline supervisors to bring a skeptical intelligence to reviewing the factual summaries and factual presentations of people under their command. It's uncomfortable to cross-examine your own people, to make sure that they're telling you the truth. But unless people view that as their responsibility, the system can't work in the way that we all want it to work. And so that's one of the things that we meant with our recommendation on leadership training. Part of what it means to lead is to make sure that your people are doing things the right way. And that starts with telling the truth about everything, about the observations they did and didn't make, and so on.
Thank you. Melissa.
I want to add to the thank yous, certainly for coming and speaking with us and to the center for working with our office to do this. My question, the past two questions might have taken a little bit of steam out of mine, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case there's more to share. But the report and the consent decree both focus on the things that the police department should do and in terms of what happens internally. But the external oversights have also failed that allowed for this to happen. And so what are the recommendations that you would have for the prosecutors who should be vetting their witnesses and for the judges who accept the testimony of police officers more often than not, given sort of the things that you found in this report?
Well, it really builds on what I just said in terms of the frontline supervisors. Prosecutors ought to be in the position of being skeptical and careful and vetting the information they get from law enforcement officers. I was a prosecutor. I didn't do that well enough. It's hard to do. It's hard to do as a matter of interpersonal relations. And that's why in the training of prosecutors, they have to be trained that is a central part of their job, is to make sure that only truthful and accurate information is presented. Judges have to be more skeptical of the information they get from law enforcement officers. I think, unfortunately, there has been enough sort of scandal here and scandal around the country that a police officer's word is not given automatically greater weight than that of an ordinary citizen, certainly to the extent that it used to be the case, where it was open and shut. You're shaking your head. Maybe that is still the case to some extent. You're in a much better position to know that than I am. But there has to be, for every participant in the process, there has to be skepticism, close questioning, insistence on the truth, and willingness to say, I don't believe you. I'm sorry. I'm not going to bring this case. Or a judge saying, I don't credit that testimony. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't ring true. Sorry, the case is dismissed. And to follow through with the police department and say, you need to look at this. I think your officer gave me testimony that I think was not true.
So I'm going to chime in with the last comment from the web because it's self-serving. Oh, we have someone coming up though. So first I'm going to let this person get our last question in and then we'll close.
Greetings. I just want to say thank you as everyone else has done so prior to me coming. I'm Reverend Dr. Greta Willis, the mother of Kevin L. Cooper, who was killed at the age of 14 by a Baltimore City police officer at the tender age of 14 in 2006. My question is, where do we go from here? I was at one of the mothers that testified during the federal trial with Judge Badar. And as you just mentioned, that he was asking the question of why, he wanted to know, why did the patient die? My question is, why should the patient not live? Allow our children to be able to live and to grow, to be responsible adults, just like every other citizen. As we have officers who are sworn to protect and to serve the public, but with their job is to do other things as opposed to protecting and serving the public. Then we have another whole system that is still in the corruption mode because of the integrity that is not built in the system, of how it has been embedded, the culture for so long, there is no excuse as to why this corruption has gone on in the department for such a long time. So again, why can't our children live? Why can't our seeds begin to flourish just like every other seed? We have parents that are coming and their children are traumatized on a daily basis. So if we're starting anew, starting afresh, it should have started with a representative or the police commissioner himself being here tonight for very important forums such as this, to be able to speak with us with integrity and be able to speak on behalf of all this taking place and where he's going from here on to build a better Baltimore for all of us to be able to cohabitate together as one. And again, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
That's a powerful statement. And so I don't want to overrule that one. I will just say that a final comment in the chat was, and it just moved, from Judge Gonzalez. Hopefully this new center will encourage all stakeholders in the criminal justice system to take on the challenge of holding each other accountable. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges all need to be leaders. What is tolerated cannot become the norm. And I hope that is at least a clarion call for all of us to continue working on this issue. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and particularly thank Michael Bromwich. Heather, do you want to have the last word here?
Just to echo that and to thank you so much. I think it's really risen to the surface tonight, this critical theme that we keep listening, especially to those who have been directly impacted by these harms. And the center remains committed to providing a space to do that listening, to have that dialogue, and to continue working together on this uphill work. You know, I'll just say in closing that it's striking the theme throughout the report, the ways in which the unrelenting violence served as a distraction to look inward and do this critically important work of accountability and rooting out corruption and having ethical constitutional policing be the standard. But it strikes me the ways in which the failure to do that actually undermines our ability to address and reduce violence, again, because of the ways that it shakes the legitimacy of our system to its core. And again, the center remains committed to working together on this. And I want to thank everyone so much for coming out to our inaugural event. It pains me that we have to end because I know there are many more questions teed up. We will promise to follow up on that and work with Mr. Bromwich and BPD to make sure these questions and comments are heard. So thank you again so much.